Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, please take your seats. Welcome to the delegation of the European Union to the US. My name is Andrea Glorioso. I'm the Counsellor for the Digital Economy here at the delegation. Welcome to this smallish but hopefully more focused workshop on the digital single market strategy and specifically on the recently adopted midterm review. I just want to do very few logistics just to let you know. I hope that you all took your food, which is outside, which is great food, by the way, better than usually we give you, so please make use of that. And please be aware that not only you're being video recorded, but you're also being live streamed, so careful about what you say. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to the Ambassador of the European Union to the US, Mr. David O'Sullivan, who will give some brief opening remarks. So, Mr. Ambassador, if you please join us.
Thanks, Andrea. Good to see you all. Glad to see a small, but I'm sure very motivated, my goodness, this is very loud, isn't it? It kind of echoes. Motivated group and some familiar faces. Andrea, I don't know why you didn't tell me that they have superior food down here, because I was upstairs at another event and I grabbed a quick sandwich, which was rather inferior. So if I'd known, thank you very much. Okay. Look, this is part of our ongoing effort to try to make sure that we have the maximum transparency and knowledge and information about what's happening on the digital single market, particularly in the United States, because we know of the huge interest which people in the US and particularly companies have in this issue. It is, I have always said, and I continue to believe, one of the most exciting initiatives of the Juncker Commission. It's one of their top 10 priorities, and for me it is a project on a par with the creation of the original single market back in 1992, because I believe profoundly, even if I don't always fully understand it, to be quite honest with you, that the digital transformation is going to radically change the way in which we do business, in which we live, in which we work. And it's very important that we equip the Europe to be able to do that with the economies of scale and the benefits of full integration across the 28 member states and the single market of 500 million people. This is appropriate because we're having our kind of midterm review, a sort of midterm report. What do you think of the show so far? Assessment. This was launched just recently, and the first thing we need to say is that we have managed to put, or the Commission has put on the table, all the legislative proposals which it announced as part of this review, so we are on track so far, with some bold ideas on how to reform our copyright, broadcasting, telecommunications, cybersecurity, and privacy regimes. And I hope you will agree, and I know this was a concern on this side of the Atlantic, that the Commission has been sparing in its use of legislation as an instrument. It has not sought to over-regulate this. You know my view. I don't think we can actually transform 28 siloed member state spheres into a single European space without a minimum of European level regulation in order to have a common sense of a common digital space. But I think the Commission has been very careful and prudent in really only proposing legislation where we consider it absolutely necessary to achieve that objective. And it has not proposed legislation in areas where it was thought that private-led or public-led, public-private solutions could provide more effective and efficient mechanisms. So, for example, our efforts to lead the digital transformation of traditional industries is focused on the coordination of national policies and targeted financial support for exchange of best practices, but not on legislation. And similarly, our assessment of online platforms and of the sharing economy, Uber, Airbnb, app stores, and so forth, has so far, at any rate, not led to the proposal for new regulation, as we believe that the existing rules just need to be better understood and better enforced. So the midterm review, arriving as it does 2 years after the launch of the DSM strategy, gives us the chance to assess whether this approach is sufficient to achieve the overarching goal, a connected digital single market by the end of 2019, which will be the mandate of this current Commission. Firstly, of course, it is absolutely essential now that the legislators who are seized of the proposals do their job and speed up the work on the key legislative dossiers that have been put on the table. For a US audience, I would dare suggest that the message for you is that if you think the digital market strategy as a whole is a good thing, that having a more integrated European digital space is a good thing, we think you might also want to provide some of that messaging to our legislators and to the importance of actually taking forward these necessary legislative steps in order to create that space. There is, frankly, a risk of losing steam or losing momentum and finding ourselves, all of us, with nice proposals on the table, but no legislation adopted. Of course, this is not to deny the member states and the elected members of the European Parliament the time they need to reflect and decide, but nonetheless, I think we do need to continue to maintain a certain sense of urgency in this process if Europe is to equip itself as rapidly as it needs with the necessary infrastructure for a true digital single market by 2019. The second point I want to make is that the Commission will be looking at a more focused approach in three additional areas, important areas. The data economy, which is absolutely fundamental and which I know is a subject of huge interest here. The Commission will be preparing a legislative initiative on cross-border free flow of non-personal data, tentatively scheduled for the autumn of this year, and an initiative on accessibility and reuse of public and publicly funded data in the spring of 2018. The Commission will also continue its work on liability in particular and other emerging data issues, and we know that creating the conditions for the free flow of data is absolutely indispensable to the full functioning of the new digital revolution as we know it. In cybersecurity, an issue of unfortunate topicality, given the events of the last week or so, the Commission will, by 2017, review the EU's cybersecurity strategy, as well as the mandate of the European Union Agency for Network and Information Security, to align it to the new EU-wide framework on cybersecurity. We will also work to propose additional measures on cybersecurity standards, certification, and labeling to try to make connected objects as more cyber secure, and we know this is one of the single biggest challenges to the digital revolution, is this whole issue of cybersecurity and the risks which we know so well, unfortunately. In the area of online platforms, by the end of 2017, the Commission will prepare an initiative to address unfair contractual clauses and trading practices identified in platform-to-business relationships, and has also taken recent competition enforcement decisions related to this. I just give an illustration. I don't want to single out one company more than any other, but we've just reached an understanding with Amazon through a competition case, some undertakings in relation to potential competitive disadvantage for bookstores about e-books, and we have agreed this with Amazon, and we're now giving this legal effect. So these are the kind of things which we are trying to do to make sure that we do have as level a playing field as possible across the European Union. And we have also developed several dialogues with online platforms within the digital single market, the EU Internet Forum, a code of conduct on illegal online hate speech, and a memorandum of understanding on the sale of counterfeit goods over the internet, again to address these issues of possible abuses of the digital single market. One of the aims is to move forward with the procedural aspects and principles on the removal of illegal content, notice and action, based on transparency and, of course, protecting fundamental rights. So these are just an illustration of some of the areas where we will continue to work. I want to stress that we really understand how very important it is that we get it right, and that in building this single market in Europe, we ensure the interconnectivity transatlantically and the ability of the transatlantic corridor to function also in the digital space, and that's a key priority for us. We welcome very much the US investments which have been made in Europe, the activities of US digital companies in Europe which create jobs, create wealth and business for us. This is very important, and we hope that we can continue that cooperation. We just saw part of the communication, and I'm sure I know some of you take your work very seriously. You may actually have read the communication on the midterm review. It starts out with pointing out that 2/3 of Europeans think that the use of most recent digital technologies has a positive impact on society, the economy, and their own lives. So there is a globally favorable outlook in Europe towards the use of new economies. On the other hand, people also do expect us to take into account some of the downsides, potential downsides of growing digitization, such as the impact on jobs or the skills gap. And we do know that there are concerns, social concerns, about how this will play out. Not that in the long term things don't settle down, but the short-term disruptive effect of some of these technologies has also to be managed if we are to continue to have popular support for enabling these technologies and their widespread use across society. So those are just some thoughts I wanted to share with you. I hope you will find this useful, an opportunity to go through this in more detail. I'd like to thank all of you, because I see many people in the room that I know are frequent attenders here on these issues, and we are committed to continuing the dialogue with stakeholders here in the United States to make sure that you have the best information possible about what's happening in Europe, and that you are best able to input to that process, because we do really welcome your contribution to the ongoing reflection about how we build a true digital single market in Europe by 2019. Thank you very much indeed. There are no questions, it's fine. Well, seriously, I don't want to just talk and run, but I suspect Andrea is better placed to answer your questions than I am, perhaps, because I know you people actually know what you're talking about, which is always a daunting challenge. But seriously, if there are any... No, okay, I've successfully intimidated them into not asking a question. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Working? Yes, even too much. Okay, so those of you who know me, and there are many people in this room who know that, first of all, as an Italian, I need to put my hands in my pocket to avoid starting flailing them around. And I also tend to be an energetic person, so I cannot stand behind a podium, so I will just move around. I hope that's not too confusing for all of you. What are we going to do now is that I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what the ambassador already presented. I think, and not only because I wrote that briefing, that the presentation was great, and it really synthesized and summarized the main points of the DSM midterm review. But of course, we can go a little bit more in detail. What I would ask you is, I think that it would be particularly helpful if we could have this as interactive as possible. Those of you who came to previous events, which we organize here at the delegation, will have noticed that this is a slightly smaller crowd than usual, and that was on purpose. You have all been very carefully selected and picked in order to, because we know that you are the people who are really following this kind of stuff very closely, and the idea is also to make sure that we can have a good conversation in the 1 hour and a half that we have for that. So at all moments, please do feel free to raise your hand, interrupt me without any problem. I believe we have a microphone flying around, or we will have it pretty soon in one way or the other. You should talk in the microphone because, as I said, we are being video recorded, and let me remind you, we're also being streamed online. So again, careful about what you say because there will be a record of all of this. Now, I don't want to repeat what the ambassador already presented. You have understood what's the state of play of the DSM, all legislation on the table. Now it's up to the Parliament and the Council to push it through. I decided not to use PowerPoint presentations for a number of reasons. One, that I hate PowerPoint presentations. Two, that you hate PowerPoint presentations. And three, that I've just been flying on missions for 2 weeks, and if there is something that I hate more than PowerPoint presentations is writing PowerPoint presentation in a hotel room. So there are no PowerPoint presentations. You're stuck with me, but after this closes, we will distribute a bunch of material, which is mostly the material that is already publicly available online. If you go to the webpage of the press release, there are all the links down there. And I would encourage you to have a look at that material, especially, and this is not something I usually suggest to people because I like all of you, so I don't usually suggest to read the supporting material that we produce, which is usually very thick and very long. But there are a couple of very, very interesting reports which accompany the adoption of the midterm review. One is the so-called results of the so-called Eurobarometer on European citizens' attitude to automation and information communication technologies. For those of you who don't know what the Eurobarometer is, that's a series of professional surveys. So again, this is not, with respect to a Facebook survey or online survey or SurveyMonkey. No, this is something that is done through in a very scientific and professional way all across the European Union. People are interviewed in their own language, which is also quite important. And we do Eurobarometers on a range of very different topics. As you may imagine, they cost a lot of money and time, so we do that on very important issues. And as part of the DSM midterm review, we ran from March to May 2017, so just now, a survey on European citizens on their, as I said, attitude towards automation, information, and communication technologies. That's where what the ambassador mentioned, the attitude, the fact that a significant majority of European citizens have actually a pretty positive attitude towards ICT. They see that. They see those technologies as helping in their lives, as potentially good for them. It comes from that survey. And as the ambassador mentioned, there are also a lot of interesting data points in the survey on what concerns European citizens. Part of that, again, as the ambassador mentioned, is the impact on jobs, the lack of skills. One very interesting point that I saw on that survey is that actually a significant majority of European citizens believe that they have enough skills to cope with the upcoming changes. And the people who prepared that Eurobarometer made sure to put a footnote in there saying, by the way, these are self-reported results, and it's very well known that self-reported results are not scientifically sound. People don't know what they don't know, basically. And now I'm sure all European citizens are great at ICT, but the reality, if I look at my close family, is that they are not nearly ready for what's going to hit them. And that's why an area in which we are focusing with particular attention, not necessarily as part of the DSM itself, although there are actions and activities in the digital single market strategy which focus on skills and reskilling, which are two very close but also slightly different problems. Very simply, the skills, it's more complex than that, but to simplify, the issue of skills is how do we prepare the people who will enter the job market in the next 3 to 8 years. The issue of reskilling is how do we cope with the fact that a lot of jobs will disappear. And the people who will lose their jobs will need to be reskilled. And let's face it, not everybody is going to become a coder or a web designer. And in any case, there will be a need for people who work in more or in existing industries to understand how they need to adapt their skill set. And these are people who can be, I think we also have the generational breakdown in the survey, from 30 to 50 or even 60 years old. And how do you make sure that those people will develop the new skills that they need in order to do their same job, but in a very different technological environment? So there is that, and that is indeed part of what we are doing in the DSM, although I should point out that in our system, in our institutional architecture in the European Union, education policy, and to a certain extent, vocational policy is primarily a responsibility of member states. So this is one of those areas, as the ambassador mentioned, where we do not, both because we don't think it will be useful, and also, to be very frank, because we cannot, as a European Union, intervene through regulatory means. This is much more about coordination, about cooperation with industry, and a lot has already been done with various alliances, specifically on digital skills. If I may, for 30 seconds, just go on the side for a moment, because I think it's important when you look at the digital single market strategy, or in general what the European Union is doing in the field of the digital economy, which, by the way, I came to believe is not a very good term, even though it's my job title. I'm the Counsellor for the Digital Economy. But I started to wonder, how do you define the non-digital economy? In 2017, what are the industries that are not already almost fully digital, or are heavily digitalized, or are going to be heavily digitalized pretty soon? So already there is that definitional problem. But the point I wanted to share with you, and by the way, on this as on everything else, as I said, I would really love to hear your views and comments and things that we need to make sure Brussels know. That's part of our job. It would be a mistake to look at the DSM as a silo in and by itself. as the ambassador mentioned, the digital single market strategy is one of the 10 political priorities of this Commission. You need to look at those other priorities as well, and certainly what we try to do in the European Commission, and I'm sure also the colleagues in the Parliament and in the Council, in the Member States, to see that particular activity, that particular big project, the DSM, which is pretty big and complex in by itself, as part of the broader set of political priorities, creating jobs, strengthening growth, ensuring that the level of social protection that we have in Europe remains as it is, adapted though to the new realities of the modern economy. On this note, let me point out that just very recently, the European Commission adopted its proposals for a European social pillar. And that is quite far away from the core issues of the DSM. But if you look there, if you look at that particular set of documents, in there, actually, there is a specific action on skills and reskilling again for the digital environment. So I would just like to, I say this not because I want this to become a discussion on everything, I'm not competent to do that, but to point out that when we think about digital economy in Europe, and I believe certainly in the US as well, we need really to look at the broader picture and how what we're doing as a European Commission from a policy and regulatory point of view has an impact on areas which, quite frankly, and I've been 10 years almost in the European Commission, the difficulty there is that the kind of people who are really expert, my colleagues who are really expert on telecommunication law, on privacy law, on corporate law, they're not always necessarily expert in labor law. And they're not supposed to be because that's not their job. So I think that's one area where we also need your help, not only you as Americans, but also from other European stakeholders. Sometimes my experience is that external stakeholders, by external I mean outside of the EU institutions, are actually pretty good at connecting the dots where we do not necessarily manage to, because it is institutional, we are not institutionally designed, not yet, we got much better, but we're not able fully to connect the dots. So please help us on that. I think we're getting there. I've been traveling extensively in the past 2 weeks, twice to New York City and once to San Francisco. And what struck me for different conferences and meetings and all the kind of stuff that I do for a living, and what really struck me is that across very different counterparts that I had, different events, different people, very different mindset, from New York to California, I can assure you that the differences felt quite heavily. There was one issue that came up time and again, two issues actually, that came up time and again. One, how to optimize the environment for investments in the European Union. And by the way, a lot of people, especially from the East Coast side, were telling me, what you're doing on the DSM is great, and we support it, but there are a lot of other things that you need to do in order, from their perspective, in order to increase investments, including on finalizing our projects on the Capital Markets Union and creating an environment which is more conducive to entrepreneurship. I'm not saying that they're right, but that's their opinion. Maybe they're a little bit right. And the second point that was raised time and again, very different people, very different backgrounds, but it came up all the time, was the impact on jobs. And I don't want to, I wouldn't like this workshop to become a whole discussion only on jobs, unless you want to. If that's a particularly sensitive point, we can devote a lot of time on that. But I was struck by that. I was struck by the fact that this is really on people's minds. Perhaps unsurprising given recent dynamics here in the US. Now, as you know, as a diplomat, I don't have political opinions unless Brussels tells me that I need to have a political opinion. I might have personal opinions, but we are not here for those. But I think it's undeniable that the whole changes in the labor market, the changes in jobs, whether people feel that they will have jobs, has had a major impact on the political discussions here, just like it has had and it will certainly have a major impact on the political discussions in Europe. So again, without wanting to turn this into a discussion about everything, but to me it's important that we try to focalize our discussions, not only now, but in the coming weeks, and what we report to Brussels, or what's important here in the US, keeping in mind this broader picture. At the end of the day, I understand that many of you work for companies which are very focused on one topic or on two topics, and maybe you work as lobbyists for those companies or public affairs in public affairs companies, and so you want to know and you want to push for, I really want Article 14.3 of the Copyright Directive to look like this and not like that. Fair enough. I'm not the person that can change that. As the ambassador said, now you need to talk to the parliamentarians and the council, because those proposals are in their hands now. We can certainly, as I hope we have done well enough for your needs, we can certainly help to convey those messages to Brussels. But to the extent possible, and I'm happy to cover those specific points as well, if you would like, to the extent possible, I would also like us to look a little bit at the broader picture. What are we seeing in the next, I mean, it's always difficult to predict things, especially future things, but maybe in the next 3-4 years, where do we see things going, and how should we make sure, what should we do in order to make sure that the conversation between the European Union and the US remains strong? Because, and I will shut up now temporarily, because I would also really like all of you, or whomever you wants to intervene, to do so. Don't disappoint me, please. Let's make this very embarrassing with silence and flies around. But ultimately, and this is the message, and not only me, but all my colleagues, the ambassador, everybody, we convey to our US counterparts, we may have disagreements here and there, sometimes more, sometimes less, but let's not forget the amount of investments that already exist between Europe and the US, the commercial relationship that we have, I dare to say also the cultural relationship that we have and the political relationship that we have. And I think it's very important that whatever problem we may address in terms of disagreements, major or minor disagreements, we keep that as a kind of a guiding light. Now with this, I will shut up temporarily, and I would like to ask if there are, I'm Italian, I cannot shut up forever, that's simply not possible. I would like to ask if there are already question points, intervention. I know that many of you will have already read the press releases. Maybe some of you, who as the ambassador says, take their job very seriously, have read all the documents. I haven't, I have to tell you, I'm still a bit behind on that. But please, now the flying microphone is ready, so does anybody have anything to say at this point in time? By the way, when you took the food, yes, I was going to say the food comes with obligations, so we don't feed you for free. So, if you may please introduce yourself, your name, the organization you work for us, and also for the people who are listening. Thank you.
Sure. Tom Struble with the R Street Institute. Today, I think this morning, the House Judiciary Committee or Senate Judiciary had a hearing on EU versus American antitrust enforcement. And at that hearing, although I didn't catch it, they discussed the new rules on platforms that the EU Commission is considering by year end, talking about new rules to impose on the platform companies in their business relationships to try and protect these small businesses and suppliers that engage with those platforms. Having not seen the hearing and also not being fully caught up on the press releases, I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about those rules that are being considered.
Absolutely. I didn't see that hearing, so I will not. I do not have direct comments or reactions to whatever was said, either in the House or Senate. And I will, by the way, thank you for pointing it out. I will look at the transcript. Sorry. Okay. So we didn't miss anything, but you know, let's be honest. I think I have a very good idea of what would have been said at that hearing, because this is not a new discussion. And on that note, I think I would ask all of us to take a small step back and understand that, first of all, the reflection on what is the role of online platforms, and I know I have this discussion with many of you multiple times. We may have disagreements on the definition of what is an online platform. From our point of view, it's an operator, an online operator, meaning using mostly information and communication technologies, which sits between two markets and basically works as a bridge between these two markets. I personally will be the first to admit this is a very broad definition. Others might want to have a smaller definition, but this is the basis on which we're working. And the reflection on what's the role of online platforms, whether we should have regulation, we don't need regulation, we have been having in Europe for quite a long time. And I'm saying that not to mean that, well, then whatever we do must be right. I'm not saying that. Actually, I think I'm supposed to say that because of my job contract, so yes, everything we do is right. But more importantly, sometimes, with all due respect, here in the US, I have a sense that when something comes out of Brussels, all hell breaks loose and the sky is falling and oh my God, this is nobody was expecting it, but we have been discussing about this for a long time. And until this moment, and believe me, there have been many pressures, sometimes at very high levels, within Europe, from the business community, from the governmental community, to have regulation. And the Commission has consistently said, until now, there is no need for regulation. You might know that we adopted back in, I want to say June last year, but I might be wrong. Anyway, last year we adopted a communication with a capital C in our system. That means a policy statement of the European Commission on the cooperative economy, because we didn't like the term sharing economies or gig economy, so we found a new term just to complicate matters. But in that communication, we basically went through all the various issues that had been raised with us on the Airbnbs of this world, the Ubers of this world, the BlaBlaCars of this world, because by the way, as you might be aware, we have online platforms in Europe as well. They're not as big, as large, and some would say as important in terms of their impact, whether it's positive or negative, than currently the American ones, but who knows? And when you do rules for everybody, not just for, certainly we don't do rules targeted at one particular country. That's not what we do. Now, until now, our assessment has been, as the ambassador mentioned, there is no need to have specific rules. If you're an online platform which provides transportation services, probably the rules for transportation services, whatever that might be, they apply. Why do we need a specific new substantive consumer protection rules? We don't. What we have to do is to make sure that consumers understand that those protections apply independently of the medium that they use, that even if platforms or whomever else puts in their terms of service that, by the way, whatever consumer protection law you might have in your country doesn't apply to us, that's a very nice piece of writing. We don't think it has a lot of legal value because most of our rules cannot be changed by a contract, and so on and so forth. Now, as part of this reflection, in the past, I want to say that considering the sector-specific inquiry that DG Competition of the Commission ran since more than 12 months, considering the studies that we have run, we have assessed this thing for this situation for more than 18 months at the very least. We do believe that there might be a need for legislative intervention on a specific issue, which is the B2B relationship between, if you look at these platforms as sitting between the suppliers and the consumers, the relationship between the suppliers and the platforms. Is that transparent enough? Do suppliers, which for a significant part, they are small and medium enterprises, do they actually get a good deal? Do the rules that exist in terms of unfair commercial practices, do we need to update, and these are existing European Union rules, do we need to update them? Now, I cannot tell you, not because I don't want to, but we're still in the initial process of devising what those regulatory measures might look like. People, both in Europe and the US, tend to get extremely tense every time we talk about regulation. Understandably, I would like to point out that there are many different ways in which you can do regulation, and a lot of those ways are extremely light touch at the end of the day. And also because I'm sure that we will do public consultations and everything, we are obliged to do that. But as a point of principle, we do not, the Commission, with its right of initiative, we do not publish the text. We do not discuss the text of what we're going to adopt. So for that, I'm afraid you will have to wait. So this is, as far as I know, as far as I understand, more or less the situation in the discussion on online platforms. Again, not because I feel the needs. I don't think we have to apologize on anything. I don't think that we need to, not that you are suggesting it, to be clear, others have, but not you, and nor anybody else in this room. I feel really that we have gone through a very, very extensive assessment on this issue. I can think of very few other policy areas, at least that I work on, with possibly the exception of data protection, the review of the GDPR, where we have gone through such an extensive exercise of engagement with stakeholders, of consultation, of analysis, etc., because we understand it is a very important issue. One point, the final point that I will make on this, sitting where I sit as the EU Counsellor here in the US, what I would like to see, and perhaps a few of the people in this room will be able to help, I think that very similar questions and very similar debates are being asked here in the US as well. Certainly throughout my trips, not only these last ones, but also before, I met with small business associations, I met with small business owners, and they're also asking similar things. It's great that we have these online platforms that provide, they don't need to do major capital investments because the online platforms are already providing that. Is this sustainable? what happens if one of the online platforms decide to change its terms of service? What happens to us? Which kind of protection do we have? So these kind of questions, I think, they're being raised both in the US and Europe, and what I think will be very productive is to make sure that we create the bridge to have that conversation, not because we will take the same decision, but because, in my experience, it does make decisions here and back in Brussels better. I remind you once again that if you have eaten something, you are under an obligation to raise your hand. Yes, please. Again, please, if you can state your name and the organization you work for. Thank you.
Alan Gibby with the International Center for Law and Economics. Just more like a logistical matter. I believe you mentioned 2 reports. You talked about the Eurobarometer survey, but you were going to bring up, or maybe I missed, another report to highlight.
Yes, absolutely. I do that all the time. I say, we've done 4 things, and then I spend 15 minutes talking about the first, and I forget about the other 3. So thank you for reminding me. So the reports that we have published as part of the midterm review of the digital single market strategy, adopted on the 10th of May. And by the way, those are only the latest ones in a long string of reports and analysis that we do all the time. There is the Eurobarometer. We published the final results of a study on ICT skills and jobs. This is a study that I believe ran for almost 18 months, and it was a quite horizontal analysis of the situation. I believe we use a sample of member states and a sample of companies in member states. What's the actual skills situation? And that's why when we look at the Eurobarometer and we see that most European citizens say, no, we're good, we know how to use ICT, because we compare those results with the other study we did, we are kind of a bit doubtful that that self-assessment corresponds to reality. So there is that. We also published the latest iteration of our, and now I'm forgetting the name, so if you will allow me, I want to give you the right name. Yes, it's the Europe's Digital Progress Report, which is an exercise that we launched back in 2014, if I remember correctly, with an assessment across multiple dimensions, for example, broadband connectivity in all the 28 member states. We're still 28, by the way, and for the time being, that's the situation. In all the 28 member states, broadband connectivity, the status of curricula and education for ICT. So it's a multifaceted index, and we have been doing that since 2014 yearly. It gives us an outlook of what's the situation in our member states on the digital economy, again, with the caveat, definitional caveat that I mentioned before. The latest report, which has been published as part of the DSM midterm review, so it's public, you will find it online, and we will share it after this event with all of you. The way I understood it, it's a rather long and complex report, but the main highlights that I saw from that is that we're getting better in terms of widespread adoption of digital technologies in the private and public sector in Europe, in terms of skills, in terms of broadband connectivity, you name it. There is a positive, we would always like to see better, but there is a positive increase from that point of view. There is also a positive, but not as good, at least as I would have liked to see, in terms of convergence across the member states. When we started the DSM strategy back in 2000, we adopted in 2015, May 2015, which means that we started actually to work on it back in 2014. One of the reasons why we launched the DSM strategy was that we saw there were significant regulatory barriers within the member states across the member states of the European Union on the kind of issues that the DSM covers. But in addition to the regulatory barriers, there were also significant differences across member states in terms of issues that might or might not be solved through regulatory means. Broadband adoption certainly is helped when you have a common European market and companies can make larger scale investments, but there are elements which quite frankly do not depend on whether you have European Union law or not. And even though, with all due respect, member states always like to blame Brussels for everything, the reality is that on certain issues, it's the member states which have to intervene. So when we started in 2014, and with the adoption of the DSM in 2015, the differences in terms of digital readiness, if you accept this term, and for the details, again, I would refer you to the actual report where we explain all the data that we use, the kind of metrics that we use, etc. The difference across member states was major. You had real digital champions. I think at the time it was either Denmark or Sweden. They still are very, very much up there in the list. But then you had other countries, including, I think, Romania, unfortunately my own home country, Italy, which were really low on the list. Now, we have moved in the right direction. The differences between member states have decreased, but there's still a little bit too much incoherence across the 28 member states. And that is, of course, a problem for us. Now, that progress report is useful for us because it's always good to have data to understand, do we actually need to do something as the union? Is there actually need to intervene with the purpose of limiting discrepancies between the member states? Because quite frankly, if we saw that all the member states are doing great and there is no difference between them, why would we do anything? And believe me, no commission official wants to write legislation. It's a pain in the neck to write legislation and to implement it and to enforce it and to monitor it. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. These differences are still there. They're better than they used to be in 2016 and 15, but they're still there. So these are the three reports, major reports, which accompanied the DSM midterm review. And as I said, they're all public and they're all reachable via the webpage of the press release, I believe, and we will send you all the links so that you can, if you had difficulty sleeping, you can go through them, and I'm sure after 30 minutes you will be asleep. I think that there was another question.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Gus Rossi from Public Knowledge. I wanted to ask you about what's the European Commission position regarding zero rating. In the telecoms package, it was not clear if zero rating was allowed or not. Then BEREC issued some kind of guidelines for national regulators that were also not explicitly banning all kind of zero rating, but also the kinds of zero rating were allowed. It was not specifically defined what it meant. Zero rating that doesn't continue beyond data caps. And recently we had the ruling of a Dutch court that apparently curtails the powers of national regulators to make interpretation of the regulation or make safe interpretation of the regulation. Given that it's the European Commission, the actor that can present legislation to the European Parliament and the actor that wrote the telecoms package, I was wondering if the European Commission felt that there's a need for clarification of the telecoms package, or if there are any actions going to be taken in the future to try to bring some clarity to the issue of zero rating in the EU.
All right, so let's try to unpack this a little bit, and also perhaps I'm not sure that everybody in the room is aware what zero rating is. Actually, and please don't be shy. Should I explain what zero rating is? Yes, okay. That's my direct boss, by the way. So, all right, Damian. So zero rating. Look, to be honest, I found different definitions throughout the discussion what zero rating. My understanding of zero rating is the practice through which a telecommunication company or a broadband provider, whether it's a fixed or mobile, although that usually applies to mobile services, basically tells you if you use your data, you go online, use the internet, you are going to pay for this amount, the data is going to cost this, or you have this amount of gigabytes to use, after which, a different pricing system applies, is triggered. But when you use service XYZ, which might be an online music service or might be a video service, etc., then that data does not count in the whatever pricing structure you might have or in the data caps, etc. Criticisms have been raised to the practice of zero rating because it was felt that this could basically allow, or at least my understanding is that it was felt that this could allow broadband providers to favor certain services with which they might or might not have commercial agreements, or might even be their own services, and this would, destroy innovation, kill babies, you name it. That depends on the people you're talking to. That's not public knowledge, I know, but there are some people out there who have rather bizarre ideas on how telecommunication law works. But anyway, that was my personal opinion, by the way, not the position of the European Union. when we adopted the Connected Continent package, and if I remember correctly, that was early 2015, all these dates kind of blur after a while, but I think that was more or less when we did it. By designing the regulation, we asked BEREC, which is the body of European electronic communications regulators, which is the 28 independent national regulatory authorities plus the European Commission. We asked BEREC for an interpretative position on certain parts of the new telecommunication rules. This is, by the way, absolutely normal. We have done it all the time since decades. BEREC is a relatively recent creation, but we had another thing before, which was called ERG, European Regulators Group, and they did exactly the same. BEREC has slightly more powers than its predecessor in terms of saying this is how regulators should actually interpret the rules. Now, BEREC, which by the way came here to the US, I think it was last year, I remember, because I helped them get, talk to people and have a few meetings so that they could also see the US experience. BEREC adopted guidelines on, I want to say on net neutrality. I'm not sure that was the precise title because we are a bit wary of using the term net neutrality in our legislation, and the US as well, by the way. We talk about open internet, but be it as it may, BEREC, after I would say, a rather substantive discussion with a public consultation, with the possibility of stakeholders to intervene, adopted these guidelines. As far as I understood the guidelines, they basically say that zero rating practices are not banned per se. They're not universally banned. They need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, keeping into the utmost account, the fact that they can lead to anti-competitive practices. In particular, if, for example, a broadband, just by pure hypothesis, a broadband provider who might be dominant in a market strikes a deal with, say, an audio-video provider, which is also dominant in the market, and this might push out other players. But this is an assessment that you cannot do ex ante. You have to do it after you have seen all the facts. Now, my personal view is that if you look at the BEREC report, there is a certain, I read between the lines, a certain preference of the BEREC against zero rating. That's what I read between the lines. But that is nowhere meaning that zero rating practices are banned. So that is the situation. The BEREC has spoken. There was a significant engagement with the Commission. So as far as I know, but it wouldn't be the first time that Brussels does something, they don't tell me, and then I discover that I'm telling you things that are not true. So I will double check. But as far as I know, the Commission does not feel the need for the time being to further clarify those issues, because my interpretation is that there is not much more clarification that can be given on an abstract basis. The clarification can only be on the specific case that is brought against the national regulator, or according to our rules in certain cases directed to the Commission. I want to spend just a couple of minutes on this Dutch case that you mentioned. So I haven't read the ruling of the Dutch court, not the least because I don't read Dutch, but my understanding from reading the document is that, so in the Netherlands, before the new telecommunication rules were adopted, the Dutch parliament had adopted its own net neutrality rules, which banned completely the possibility of zero rating. Now, a very important principle in European Union law is called the supremacy of European Union law. That means that once the European Union adopts a piece of legislation, which, by the way, it adopts via the two on the basis of a Commission proposal, on the basis of the decision of the two co-legislators, which are the European Parliament, directly elected by European citizens, including Dutch ones, and the Council, which represent the member states, including the Netherlands. So the notion there is that once the European Union, through our democratic procedures, adopts a law, member states cannot either introduce new laws or maintain old laws that contradict European Union law. That would be a tad too easy, honestly, and then we would have no single market, no union. What happened is that once the new telecommunication rules were put in place, the Dutch law, for that, my understanding, for that specific part on absolute banning of zero rating, was seen as contravening European Union law, which does not absolutely and ex ante ban all forms of zero rating. That is the situation as I understand. I must tell you, I know that there are a lot of groups which are either very happy or very angry on that particular decision, but from a procedural point of view, that was a no-brainer, an absolute no-brainer, to the extent that the Dutch court did not even feel necessary to refer the matter to the European Court of Justice, which you do as a high court in the member states, usually when you feel, there are possible different interpretation of what European Union law says on this, so let's ask the European Court of Justice. In this case, the Dutch court didn't even feel it necessary because it was very obvious that the absolute ban on zero rating in Dutch law, in the previous Dutch national law, was not compatible because of that absolute element with European Union law. So, apologies. This is the situation as I understand it today. If the Commission decides that we need to provide more clarification, etc., I will certainly let you know, but I'm not aware of that at the moment. Other questions? Yes.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Garrett Workman with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I know you aren't allowed to talk about politics, but I'm going to ask a political question and see what we get anyway. There's been some elections recently in Europe which have gone in a more pro-European direction, especially in France a couple weeks ago. And I'm wondering if that's led to any changes in Brussels or at the council level on their views on digital policy. For example, there's been talk of a new regulation on the free flow of data within Europe, if that might be unblocked a little bit by a French change in government, potentially. Just your views on the sort of political dynamics of this issue.
I think I'm allowed to talk about European politics. What I cannot do is talk about US politics. But and in any case, even talking about European politics, I will choose my words very carefully and I will try to be very... I'm sorry? Can I add something? Yes, please. There is a follow-up on that question. Please, Frank, go ahead. State your name, etc.
Fran Burwell, Atlantic Council. President Macron, when he was campaigning, also said that he wanted to find a way to get around encryption so that security services would have access to data and they could force companies to do that. So I don't know if that's a discussion that's at loggerheads with some of the other European governments, and so I would like you to add that to the consideration of the French position.
All right, I really hope the encryption debate will not be raised, but that's unavoidable, I guess. So let me try first to react to the broader point raised by Garrett, and then perhaps something on the encryption/security point raised by Fran. Again, I will try to choose my words very carefully because at the end of the day, I can barely speak for the European Commission. I certainly cannot speak for national governments. That's their business to do so. My sense, though, is that if I look at the kind of debates that we have had certainly on the digital single market from May 2015, when we launched the strategy. I mean by that the kind of positions that have been taken by the different member states and also by the parliament, even though technically members of the European Parliament do not represent their country, they represent European citizens, but theory and reality sometimes are slightly separate. Now, if I look at those dynamics, France was, and in my view still is, recognized fully the importance of having a digital single market. That has never been in question from my perception. It has been a very constructive participant in all the discussion that we have had on the various sub-actions of the DSM. It's a very well-known fact that France, for many reasons, pays particular attention, perhaps more than other member states, on aspects related to intellectual property and in particular to copyright. And here, again, I'm focusing only on the DSM strategy. We're not having a discussion on European policies in general. So that was certainly true, and as far as I can see, is still true. It is also true that in the discussion on the free flow of data and discussion about data, and this is the word that after many years speaking English, I always manage to mispronounce. So data sovereignty, is that how you pronounce it? Sovereignty, I always get the accent wrong. So the discussion on data sovereignty, France, not necessarily the government, the Parliament of France and the CNIL, which is their independent authority for civil liberties, etc., took positions at times which called for, at the very least, a better understanding of what it means for you as a country, not you the US, but for a country to have strategic control over the data of your citizens, of your businesses, in particular key businesses, etc. So that discussion was particularly strong in France, and there have been I wouldn't say, fights, but there have been differences of opinion, clearly. Most of them were public, so I'm not revealing anything that goes on in the Council, between, say, Sweden and Estonia and Denmark, between the Nordics, for example, and France, and to a certain extent, Italy and Spain. So that debate was there. On the other hand, when it comes to the internal free flow of data within the European Union, and by the way, you're probably very much aware of that, but I find it useful also for the people who are listening to us. The free flow of data initiative that is mentioned in the press release of the midterm review, which we already worked on, concerns the free flow of data within the European Union. It's not about the free flow of data outside of the European Union, which follows different rules, and you're all very much aware of those rules. In that particular debate, I never perceived, quite frankly, that France was saying, no, we don't want the data to get out of France within the European Union. There have been cases in which, and I think those are legitimate and part of the discussion, there can be cases for security reasons or for other important public policy reasons in which a member state might say, okay, we want at least a copy of the data in the country. But again, this is a very, very much an ongoing debate, and I don't sense that the current French government, I never had the pleasure to meet Monsieur Macron. I would like to. I think he's a great, here I will express a personal opinion. I'm very happy that Monsieur Macron won the presidency. But let me add a final thought on this, Gareth, that let's not forget that we had the presidentials in France. We're going to have the legislative election pretty soon, I think that this weekend or next weekend, but in a few days. And that might change the dynamics, the internal dynamics in France, and therefore the position of France vis-a-vis other European partners and the rest of the world. Maybe they won't, maybe they will change it significantly. So I would suggest before we make assessments, I personally think it would be wise to wait until the result of the legislative elections. On the encryption issue that Fran from the Atlantic Council raised, I will admit I did not see that statement by candidate Macron. Speaking in very generic terms, campaigning is very different from governing, and I think we have seen that at length, wherever you may live in this wonderful world. So I would not necessarily read a lot into a campaign statement, whether it comes from Monsieur Macron, Madame Le Pen, or Chancellor Merkel, or anybody else, quite honestly. What is important for me as well, for me at least, is that debate on encryption policy has been going on for quite some time already in Europe. Let's be very clear, there are very significantly different positions on the matter. A number of law enforcement agencies have called for some kind of, I don't like to use the term backdoor because I do believe it's technically inaccurate in most cases. Of what, when we had this discussion, I think the term backdoor is very emotionally loaded and doesn't necessarily describe well what law enforcement wants, but be it as it may, just to simplify, some law enforcement agencies want some kind of access to encrypted data. A number of other players, not only the civil libertarian groups, by the way, but also many businesses and a number of politicians, including, incidentally, the Vice President of the European Commission, Andrew Ansip, who is responsible for the DSM, who has, in no uncertain term, said that from his point of view, there should be no weakening of encryption. That would be very damaging for the trust of people in the online environment, which is already not that high, to be honest, so that should not be done. But that is the position of the Vice President of the European Commission. As far as I know, it's not yet a position of the European Commission as a whole. I would also point out, Fran, that in the middle of those debates, in the heat of those debates, and I think it was, I want to say March or April 2016, but again, these dates tend to blur after a while, Udo Ulbrecht, who is the director of ENISA, which is the European Network and Information Security Agency, so it's the EU independent agency, which is responsible to advise European institutions and to the extent that they want, member states on cybersecurity good practices, policies, etc. It does not have an operational role. For the moment, it has more of an advisory role. And by the way, as the ambassador mentioned, we are also reviewing the mandate of ENISA in the coming months because the time had come, and maybe we have to see whether ENISA should have a slightly different role than it has. But be it as it may, the director of ENISA and the director, and I'm blanking on the name, the director of Europol, which is the European Police Cooperation Office, issued a joint statement. Sorry, Damien? Wainwright, thank you, issued a joint statement basically saying, but what they said was basically encryption is very important and law enforcement is very important, which I'm not exactly know where it leaves us, but the way I read the statement is that at the very least there is a recognition that a confrontational approach on that issue is not going to solve anything, because there are, in Europe as in the US, but you're asking about Europe, the way I will conclude, I think, is by saying it's an extremely thorny problem, it's an extremely complex problem, there is a recognition that it's a complex problem. I believe that the right people are sitting around the table, which was not necessarily the case 1 year ago or a couple of years ago, which is always unfortunate. On a very personal level, so this is not a position of the European Union, I will just point out that having worked in the ICT sector for almost 20 years, I see the incredible importance of a strong encryption systems for e-commerce. I think that citizens, and this should be a real broad political debate, also had to be realistic on what they expect from law enforcement. In the sense that citizens should accept that, okay, we want strong encryption. There are certain things that law enforcement or counter-terrorist entities will not be able to do in order to protect us. Because my experience is that sometimes people want it both ways. They want strong encryption and they want zero risk on the security side. And something sometimes has got to give. But that, again, that was a very personal opinion on the position of the EU. So maybe I go first back there to Huawei, if I remember correctly, and then here in front.
Thank you, Andy Purdy with Huawei. Two non-regulatory questions. I wanted to get a handle on the extent to which the European Commission and ANISA are involved in. One has to do with the capacity building through the Global Forum for Cybersecurity Expertise, which has their annual meeting next week in Brussels, as you know, and the Global Cyber Capacity Maturity Model, the Cyber Risk Index, ways to understand where the member states and other nations stand in terms of their capacity building, not just in terms of where they say they're standing, but kind of an objective approach. Secondly is the use of the purchasing power of ICT buyers to try to drive more secure products and services. The use of standards, or some ISO standards on supply chain risk. ISO is working on a buyer's guide. East West Institute has a buyer's guide. Just wanted to get your reaction to those two non-regulatory approaches to try to reduce risk.
Thank you, Andy. You're getting a little bit into the nitty-gritty details, so I'm not sure I have immediate factual and clear answers to your questions. We are taking note of those, so if you don't mind, I might probably have to come back to you after consulting with colleagues in Brussels. What I do know is that on the first forum that you mentioned, I do know for a fact that the Commission is involved in that, that ENISA is involved in that, so we are participating in that capacity building forum. As part of our foreign action, the European External Action Service, which is the EU Foreign Service, if you will, as well as DG DevCo, which is our long-standing development cooperation Directorate General of the European Commission, we have been investing quite a bit of money in a strategic way in capacity building on cyber issues, cyber security, training for judges, for law enforcement, in many countries around the world where, with all due respect, perhaps the level of preparedness is not that great, and unfortunately they tend to be the countries where a lot of cyber attacks and cyber criminals tend to come from. So there is that, but for the details, I will need to double check and get back to you. On the second point of your question, we actually have in the room the head of the trade section, who probably knows more about procurement, surely knows more about procurement than I do. I don't know if he wants to add something. What I know, he doesn't. Thank you, Damien. But I do know that back in 2008, and I had just joined the Commission, and on that year we adopted our action plan on critical information infrastructure protection, which was the first piece of paper that I co-wrote for the European Commission. In that context, we started to assess, can we use our procurement rules in order to push vendors to raise the level of quality of their products, preparedness for public authorities. I'll be honest with you, I don't know where we stand with that. My understanding at the time, and I don't think that, and we discussed this issue, remember, with the experts in the Commission about public procurement, my understanding at the time is that we could do it, both in terms of EU law and international obligations, trade obligations of the EU, but I don't know where we stand with that. I will point out, though, on that point, although it's related, it's not directly about procurement, but it's related to that as part of the Network and Information Security Directive, which we adopted, it's EU law just a few months ago, there is an obligation incumbent upon member states, which they accepted by approving the directive, to develop national cybersecurity strategies and to reach a minimum level of cybersecurity preparedness. That level, the metrics to be used for that are to be decided through the cooperation, technical cooperation mechanisms that we have in place in the EU. I would imagine that some member states might decide to, in order to move faster from the point of view, to also use public procurement coherently and compatibly with European Union rules. But I don't know, I don't follow that area that closely. But again, we're taking note of this, and I will, if you give me some time, we will get back to you on that. I think we had the lady here, if you can wait for the microphone, will arrive in a moment.
Hi, Rachel Stelly with TABC. The proposal for the e-privacy regulation was introduced in January to update the existing directive. Since then, many have expressed concerns about its alignment with GDPR and about tying it so closely to the also pending Electronic Communication Code. Do you know if Parliament's looking to resolve these concerns, and is the timeline still to implement it simultaneously with GDPR next May?
The short answer is that I have no idea. The longer answer is that, no, honestly, I really do not, as a habit, share whatever the European Parliament or the Council, for that matter, might or might not want to do. One, because it's their responsibility, and two, because by experience, I know that planning in this field is quite difficult. But I don't mean to be difficult or dismissive. It is an important question. We are aware, I'm aware, we're all aware in the Commission that there have been criticism on a perceived incoherence between the privacy regulation, the proposal for an e-privacy regulation, and the GDPR. I spoke just recently about this with the colleagues in Brussels who are following that, and we don't see those. And I will tell you that the e-privacy, I can give you a little bit of background information on the internal work of the Commission. The e-privacy regulation was actually supposed to be, the proposal for the e-privacy regulation was supposed to be adopted a little bit earlier than it was. And it was actually postponed to make sure that, as in the meantime, discussions on the way in which the GDPR, which was already low at that point, discussions in the way in which the General Data Protection Regulation, discussions that are taking place through the national data protection authorities was going on, it was decided to wait a little bit just to make sure to get maximum clarity. So as far as I know, we do not see that incoherence. I'm aware that the Working Party Article 29 and the European Data Protection Supervisor have raised certain concerns. They are independent authorities, and they have the right to express the views that they want. We listen to them very carefully. But as far as I know, and just to avoid giving you wrong information, I will double check that with Brussels, we are not particularly convinced that there are major discrepancies in terms of legal interpretation between the proposal for a regulation of the Privacy Directive and GDPR. And as you pointed out yourself, because that the GDPR is already law. It was after 4 very grueling years, it became European Union law a few months ago. The privacy regulation is a proposal. It will go through it is going through the Parliament and the Council, and quite frankly, God knows what is going to come out of that process. Well, I'm exaggerating, it's not like it's going to turn into a directive or milk skimming, but anyway, it's going to be different from the proposal that we had. I think that Google had a, yeah.
Hi, I'm Michelle Lynch with Google, and thank you so much for doing this and taking the time to discuss. I just had a question on if you could provide some more insights on the notice and action piece. I guess by the end of the year, they're trying to make a decision on whether or not to have a EU-wide mechanism for notice and action, and we certainly see that as something that could be very beneficial to stakeholders. So any insights you can provide on that and how that would work with the existing code of conduct as well?
All right, so perhaps again to unpack a little bit and give a bit of background, although US federal law is very similar from this point of view, in fact, I believe that we model our original piece of legislation, the e-commerce directive, in many ways on existing US law. But point being is that in the EU system, just like in the US federal system, technically we call them information society service providers, and there is a big debate on what that category actually includes or not. But just to simplify, it's not a legal term, but just to simplify, online platforms, online operators are generally exempted from liability on what their users are doing by using those services, unless they're notified, and that's the notice part, and they take expeditious action to remedy whatever is being notified to them. I believe, but that depends on the national interpretation of the e-commerce directive. There are some member states which also, on the basis of their own national, civil law, constitutional tradition, that depends on the member states, also say, well, it's not only about the notification. There are also cases in which you could not know that something was happening. As a reasonable business operator, you had to know on the basis of other data that something wrong was happening, so you should have intervened anyway. But that, again, depends on, is slightly different across member states, which is one of the reasons why we are assessing the situation, because what's been happening, and this predates the DSM, by the way, already back in 2010, the European Commission launched and ran a very extensive exercise to assess the implementation of this electronic commerce directive, which is, again, used to be the main piece of legislation dealing with the notice and action framework. We saw that there were discrepancies across member states. We saw that there were a number of issues that, quite frankly, from our perspective, were not ideal in terms of a coherent application of that system. And this, by the way, also created problems for businesses which could not scale as much as they would have liked, because all at once they had to deal with slightly different implementations or definition. For example, I still remember the French national law implementing the commerce directive, including search engines into the notion of information society services, of information society service providers. Other member states did not. So if you're a search engine, as you might be, what do? Which law applies? So there were these discrepancies. We ran this very lengthy exercise. In the end, back at the time, it was decided that legislation was not appropriate because the level of problems that we encountered was not such to justify a heavy regulatory intervention, but we published back at the time a clarificatory document, an interpretive document. This was 2010. In the meantime, the world changed. And then all at once, things that were, online platforms were already important in 2010, but they were not nearly as central in so many human activities as they are today. And unavoidably, as is my experience in civil service, in public life, a number of different initiatives, some would say were, thank God, started. Some would say they mushroomed. So you had this discussion on hate speech, online platforms and hate speech, online platforms and counterterrorism, online platforms and intellectual property, online platforms and minors protection. And this is creating, quite frankly, if you read between the lines of the diplomatic language using the press release, it's clear to us that this is creating a confusion. This is creating a problem also in terms of resources, because let's face it, there are only that many colleagues in the European Commission who are following these issues. There are only that many people in companies who are expert on those issues. So having multiple platforms, not even considering the issue of making sure that the results, whatever comes out of the discussion on these platforms, is coherent. The results are coherent with each other. Coherent to a certain extent, because the kind of action you take, for example, to fight child pornography are not the same that you take for copyright infringement. These are two very different problems with two different set of actions required. In any case, because of this, the Commission said that we are going to try to make some order here. We are going to make an assessment. So which dialogues online platforms to discuss the role of online platforms and so on and so forth. What do we have? What are the results? Can we make a proposal that will provide some level of clarity, as much as possible on a general level, on what a coherent European notice and action system should look like? That is what we want to do. What will be the actual content of the proposal, what we're going to say or not say, that will depend. I don't want to repeat myself. It's the way any political system works, and certainly ours. There will be consultations, there will be studies. as the press release, as the Commission announced, by the end of the year, we will come out with, I don't want to say something wrong, do we say legislative proposal on that? No, because if we say legislative proposal, it means that we're already convinced. If we don't, it means that it might be legislative or it might be non-legislative. This is why I'm not sure at all that we're already committing to a regulatory proposal, but I will have to double check the press release, which unfortunately I did not learn by heart before this meeting. Let me just check, Gus, let me just check, because I think we have the room until 2, now it's 1:40, so we still have some time. Please, go ahead, yes.
Yeah, Gus Rossi again from Public Knowledge. I have a related question related to your previous answers on OTTs, over-the-top services. The e-privacy draft includes some new responsibilities over new responsibilities over over-the-top services. Some European network operators have been calling in the telecom package debate and institutions such as the ITU for a re-regulation of OTTs and created what the so-called level playing field that had been included or that have been part of the conversations regarding the telecom package that was out of a telecom package is now again in the e-privacy directive, given that the European Commission is also representing the EU and international institutions. I was wondering what was the position of the European Commission regarding this debate.
So on the debates on the international and specifically, if I understand your question correctly, Gus, the debates at the ITU, I would need more details on what we are exactly talking about because the ITU, much like any other large international organization, does a lot of things. There are a lot of discussions. So before I tell you anything on that, I'd like to understand better what we're talking about. And by the way, I'm personally not following ITU stuff. I used to, but now my job is bilateral, so I don't follow that part of the things, of the discussions very closely. But again, I'm happy, once I understand what we are talking about, I'm happy to talk to my colleagues in Brussels and ask them what it is that we're doing exactly at the ITU. Now, on your broader point, well, I think it's not a secret to anybody in the room, but I will share with you a dirty little secret, that businesses always ask regulators to regulate their competitors. Every single business that I met, and by the way, Silicon Valley does it, European telcos do it, farmers do it, everybody does it. The job of the European Commission or of any other public authority or of any other regulator, and we are from certain points of view a regulator, from other points of view have a more quasi-legislative, but I don't want to bore you with that. Point being, we receive all that input and we assess on the basis of certain basic principles what needs to be done. I am very much aware that there are a lot of people in the Commission, in Europe, including some politicians and commissioners who are very fond of the term level playing field. Not that I can convince them, but I will share with you that I repeatedly begged those senior decision makers to stop using the term level playing field because it doesn't mean much, it's very politically charged, it has no legal meaning, and it is most of the time misunderstood and misinterpreted, quite frankly, here in the US. And in fact, people, I understand why they want to use the term, it's kind of catchy and, let's defend Europe and blah, blah, blah. But to me, it would be much better to use another term, which is also a legal principle. It's a shared legal principle between the US and Europe and most other WTO nations, which is non-discrimination. If you are providing the same service or functional equivalent service, in most cases, it should not matter which medium or which tool or which technology you're using to provide that service. So to use your example of the telecommunication, of the most recent proposal on telecommunication reform, the European Code, as we call it, if you actually look there, there are very few obligations that are added for some over-the-tops, but the example I always give is if you are a so-called over-the-top or an internet service or whatever you may want to call it, which interfaces with the public switch network for telephones. Okay, there are a lot of voice over IP systems out there which do interface with the public telephone network. For that particular function, why should you not be subject to at least some of the same requirements that traditional telecommunication operators have, including on consumer protection, including on safeguarding the security of your systems? Why? because internet. That's not the way we operate. And that's not the way, in my view, that any government or any public authority should operate. And likewise, in the proposal for the privacy regulation, as far as I saw, the potential additional obligations over the tops are quite frankly very limited. I will share another little secret that in most, as far as I'm aware, in most of the discussion that we had with some of those over the tops, and I will not name names, but as a matter of fact, those over the tops had already implemented whatever obligation we were going and we put in the regulatory proposal. They were already doing it. For them, it made absolutely no business difference. But it was a point of principle because they did not like, and they do not like, to have additional regulation. Now, on that, and by the way, I don't mean this to be confrontational. I understand why over-the-tops might not want to be overly regulated. From our perspective, the argument that we saw against extending some pre-existing obligation that already apply to telecommunication operators to new over-the-tops, they didn't convince us very much. Again, point being, is not about the level playing field, which I have no idea how to define the level playing field, and please don't tell my bosses. I would still like to spend some more months here in the US before I get called back to Washington because I said too much. But it's really about a non-discriminatory treatment, which, as I said, it's a very well-recognized and uncontroversial principle in both the European and the US system and many other countries' system. So I hope I answer your question, Gus. On the ITU point, again, you need to, maybe offline, you need to tell me exactly what it is that you're interested in so that I can ask the colleagues in Brussels or in Geneva. Yes, we still have some more time, I think.
Hi, Kara Sutton with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Could you give us kind of a rundown of what proposals we should be looking for by the end of the year and any key accomplishments the Commission would like to see? And then also, I know that a new commissioner was just named. Do you have any idea when she might make her first visit to the U.S.?
So I'll start from the second part. And God, I should have checked that before that because I know we have a new Bulgarian commissioner, and now I'm blanking on the name. It's a very bad thing because she's actually going to have the portfolio I work on. So, sorry? There you go. You can always count on the Department of Commerce to know what the European Commission doesn't remember. So Maria Gabriel, she's indeed a Bulgarian MEP. She has been proposed by the Bulgarian government as to fill in a position of a commissioner. The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, has decided to offer her the portfolio that was of Commissioner Oettinger, so Digital Economy and Society. To be clear, as far as understood, the new commissioner has accepted, in principle, the portfolio, but she has to go through the European Parliament hearing process. And quite frankly, I don't know what the timing is. I would imagine that on the part of the Commission, there is certainly a wish to make that as quick as possible. But in terms of the first visit, I will certainly recommend to the new Commissioner once she will be, first of all, I will apologize for not remembering her name, and secondly, I will tell her, you should come to the US as soon as possible, but I don't have precise details on that. On the first part of your question, which is what should we be looking for, etc. Now, I will admit that it's extremely difficult for everybody, and I'm sure you sympathize with that because most of you have to follow what's happening in the DSM. And even for me, particularly sitting here in Washington, to know at any given point in time, where do we stand with the various legislative proposals? Because again, it's easier when it's our proposal, and then I can tell you, yes, it's going to come out most probably then. But right now, the various proposals are, bouncing between committees, and committees in the Parliament are fighting on who should have the responsibility over that. I can tell you 2 or 3 things. The first, as the ambassador already said, and as, by the way, the European Council, which is not, just to confuse things matter, as some of you know, the European Council is not the Council of the European Union, nor is the Council of Europe, which has nothing to do with the European Union. The European Council is we like councils, we really love them. The European Council has the European Council, which is the heads of state and government of the 28 EU member states, is the highest political power that exists in the European Union, has repeatedly urged for a swift adoption of all the legislative proposals of the DSM. So the political pressure is there. If you believe that the minister of the national governments listen as they should to their own prime minister or president, that's a good sign. Secondly, we on our side, we have urged for, if we had to, we want all the proposals to be adopted as quickly as possible. And by the way, 2 or 3 of those proposals, as you know, have already been fully adopted. I think it's the content portability proposal, the 700 megahertz coordination proposal, those are already EU law. Certainly, we want all the proposals to get through and be adopted as quickly as possible, but if we really had to choose, and I think it is actually in the press release, we have called for a very swift adoption of the new telecommunication rules. We do believe that that is really key because it's kind of the basic infrastructure on which everything else will run. If we don't have a regulatory system which allows for better investments at scale in the sector, which allows for better harmonization, so also consumers, which can be both end users or businesses, know what they get when I'm Italian and I get a service from Poland, etc. If we don't have that quickly, everything else will be delayed. So again, we want everything to be adopted as quickly as possible, within reason, because we also want things to be discussed properly, certainly by the end of the current mandate of this commission. I would say that's for us really the ambassador already spoke about that, so I don't want to repeat what he said. But for us, it's really important not to lose steam, and therefore we know by experience that when a commission changes, there is a whole process of reassessing, should we do the same things that the previous commission was doing, and that would be very unfortunate. In terms of priority, the telecommunication package is really key. In the package, in the press release package, and again, part of the document that we will share, one of the annexes, right at the bottom, which is unfortunate because it's quite important, is a snapshot of the state of play, the legislative state of play of all the Commission proposals. Where do they stand in the Parliament? Where do they stand in the Council? Now, I have asked, and I know I discussed about this with some of you, I have lost many weeks discussing with people in Brussels and telling them we need to have a web page in the website of the European Commission where you go and you just bloody click on proposal 1, 2, or 3, and you know where it stands. Because right now, I cannot find the status of the proposals, and it's 10 years that I work for that institution. I don't want to think what other people do. Now, there have been a number of organizations, I believe, I might be wrong, but I think I remember TABC and a few other law firms which have put out websites where you can track these things. The problem there is that I'm sure they're perfect and I'm sure they're very accurate, but they're not authoritative information. They're not the information from the Parliament and the Council. So if I may ask you a favor, please bombard very politely and very diplomatically, but bombard the European Commission asking them, please put up that tool because it's really important. And it would allow people like you and everybody else to know at any given point in time, where do we stand? And also make sure, the ambassador kind of hinted at that. It's not that we don't want to talk to you guys. We, meaning the European Commission, we're very happy to talk to you. But I think it's very important, especially for a US audience, which is perhaps sometimes a little bit less sophisticated about the EU framework, just like Europeans are not sophisticated at all about the US framework, to understand who do you actually have to ask. Because for many of the Commission proposals at this point in time, all I can tell you is, look, we made the proposal. And if you want to know where it stands and what are the priorities, you really need to go and talk to the Parliament, the Council, that parliamentarian. So that, I believe, will be very helpful for you as well. Would also save a bit of our time. I love talking to all of you, but sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. How much time do we have? So we have 7 minutes. Can I ask how many people still want to ask questions? Please raise your hands. Only one. Perfect. Okay, so we'll get this question and possibly a smart answer, and then we'll close the dances.
Of course we're going to have a smart answer. Fran Burwell, Atlantic Council, you've spoken a lot about the state of play of regulations and directives, but legislation. But there was an earlier question about competition policy, but I'd like to get a feeling for how you think that may evolve. What are the discussions, if any, between US antitrust and DG Comp, particularly on digital issues, and whether digital issues require a different framework of competition policy, or how do you interpret old competition policy, market share, et cetera, in this new digital age?
Thank you, Fran. And as I'm not Margrethe Vestager, you understand that I cannot give you an authoritative answer on that. Margrethe Vestager, the EU Commissioner for Competition Policy. And by the way, I do have a colleague in the room who is the expert on competition policy, but I know she will not want to help me, so I get to answer this all by myself. But she's sitting there. She's Sibyl, so if you have questions on competition, she's also a very good source of information. Now, more seriously, and I'm serious about Sibyl's competence, by the way. But on the question, on the specific question, Commissioner Vestager, I believe that she has already been multiple times to the US. I believe the last time she was here was end of March. Sibyl, is that right? Yes, it was end of March. And by the way, as part of that visit, Sibyl and I also organized a roundtable between the Director General of DG Competition, I'm really blanking on the name, this is not good for my career, Lettenberger, yes, Johannes Lettenberger, with a think tank here in town, with a few key. So, point being that that conversation is ongoing. It's very strong. It has been a strong conversation for a long time. There are, by the way, all kinds of administrative cooperation agreements between DG Comp and relevant antitrust authorities here in the US, including the relevant parts of DOJ and the FTC. In some cases, I believe even FCC for what concern. I remember seeing one, but Sibyl is shaking her head, so no FCC. There is absolutely nothing to do with FCC, but in any case, there is already that conversation. I think that what you are hinting at, Fran, is the question, which is a very important question. Are the instruments that we are using to make assessments of in antitrust or competition matters, whether what is a dominant position, what is an abuse of dominant position, what is a relevant market, what constitutes a cartel, or all these kind of questions, are we using the right tools to make that assessment? As I mentioned, I think I was just in San Francisco last week, I believe, and I had a discussion with a few, not the big ones, because I've already talked a lot with them, which is great, but some of the smaller companies and some of the law firms that work for those smaller companies, and they were pointing out to me, it wasn't the first time, but this really came up repeatedly, you can have a 10-person company with a very significant capitalization, and yet, because of the network effects and the scaling power of new technologies, they can have a very significant effect on any given market. And so the question is, how do we judge what is a dominant company? I'm not an expert, I studied, but I'm not an expert in competition policy at all. I do know that there is an ongoing reflection, as I understand, within DG Comp. It's a more public discussion that was triggered, the more public part was triggered by the German and the French national antitrust authorities, which published a few months ago this discussion paper on big data and competition. I would point out that, as a matter of fact, the European Commission has always considered the amount of data, whether it's financial data or other forms of personal data, has always considered data as part of any antitrust assessment it has been doing. Now, it's recent news that I think yesterday the Commission fined, and Facebook accepted, fined Facebook for providing, I don't want to, I hope I'm using the right legal terms, but I would refer you to the specific press release of the Commission, but I believe the word that we used was Facebook provided misleading information on the way when there was the WhatsApp-Facebook merger, on the way in which the data of WhatsApp users could be automatically associated with the data of Facebook users. And at the time, during the merger, which was 2010, I believe, Facebook said, we don't even know how to do it. It turns out that apparently they actually did. And so it was a bit of an unfortunate situation, but which was solved to the full satisfaction of both parties. Point being, that when we did that merger assessment in 2010, we already considered the data element. So that question was already on the table. We simply considered, and some people agreed, some people disagreed, we simply consider it does not change the final result of our assessment. So to conclude, Fran, and I'm not sure this is a smart answer, but what I would tell you is there is certainly a sense, there has been for some time, a sense in the European Commission that one has to look beyond more traditional metrics, such as number of employees, number of consumers, the SNP test, blah, 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 everything that is used under antitrust analysis. There is a need to keep ourselves updated. On the other hand, whatever we do, whatever any antitrust regulator does, and certainly whatever the European Commission does, tends to have a horizontal effect. We do not favor, and this I was told in very clear terms by colleagues in COMP, we do not necessarily favor sector-specific assessments. That makes the life of businesses very complicated, and because we live under the rule of law, we like to make our rules as generally applicable. So before we change, before we go to a change, and I'm not saying there will be changes in our assessment methodologies, but certainly before we get to even considering a change, we need to think very carefully not only what the impact on the quote-unquote digital economy might be, but also what the impact on other sectors might be that we don't see now. So I'm not sure the answer was smart, but it's all you will get, Fran, because I don't have anything else to rely on. Okay, so I think that we have come to an end of our discussion. This is exactly what I wanted. This was very interactive. Thank you very much. We will distribute, as assumed that we have all of your email addresses and probably a ton of other personal data, which we are going to abuse, of course. But we are going to distribute to you the material, that's mostly the press release and everything associated with the press release as soon as possible. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll see most of you, I guess, when I come back from my trip to Brussels, where I need to report what's going on here in the US to my superiors at the beginning of June. Thank you very much again.